Hello everybody, this is Albert with Green Tea House. I hope you're doing well today. Today we're going to continue this series on why the typical American man does not drink hot tea and discuss the advertising and one would say maybe propaganda that was done in the 19th century that started to make this shift and trend. Now before we begin, if you haven't done so already, please visit Casey9 at the Tea Store. We'd love to see you. Also subscribe and hit the notification bell if you haven't done so already and post a comment. So I'll put a banner up here for episode 1. And I thought this was an interesting topic. And I don't think, it's not like I'm perusing Reddit and YouTube looking for content that's similar to this. But I think it's something that needs to be talked about because let's look at the competitor to tea, which is coffee. Men will drink coffee. Now, maybe men might not drink the over sugary, girly type of coffee that you see, the confectionery coffee that you see Starbucks and other places do, but they'll drink coffee. So coffee is more consumed by men than tea. And from a historical perspective, and my degrees are in history, and I just love history. From a historical perspective, I just find this to be interesting. I find this to be interesting because throughout all of tea history, tea was drunk by men and women, but largely men, if you go back to antiquity. And unlike coffee, where really the Arabica bean wasn't really discovered, there wasn't a lot of written records on coffee really until the 1600s when it was pulled out of Ethiopia and later in Yemen, and then the Ottoman traders picked it up and the Sufis started to drink it. So it wasn't until the 1600s that you started to see writings on coffee. We've had writings on tea since the ancient times. And you look at probably the quintessential book on it, Lu Yu's Cha Ching, the classic of tea, that was written in the 700s AD, 700 AD, when Europe was deep in the Dark Age. Either way, so on the first episode, we kind of talked about the historical kind of precedent, like how the majority of the world men drink tea, and historically men drink tea. Today we're talking about why is it that when men think about hot tea, they think of women drinking it. And a lot of this was a shift that was done in advertising. It started in the 1800s. So when we have a 6-part series here on tea in England, the social history of tea in England. So when tea got to, let me make sure I drink my ginger pu'er here while it's still hot. When tea got to England in the 1660s, 1670s, and you look for about 100 years, it was sold in tea houses. And these tea houses were nothing like the tea houses that you would see today. They were smoky, grimy, and only populated by men. Women would not go into a tea house. You could say the same thing about early coffee houses around this time too. Women would not go in them. They would send, the poor were not drinking tea at this time because it was just way too expensive. But the wealthy women would send in their servants, their male servants, to procure tea, or their husbands would procure tea from them from these tea shops. But it was men. It was men drinking tea. And you saw this for about the first 100 years. It wasn't until Twinings was the first tea shop that women started to go into, and in Twinings kind of advertised it where this is essentially a place safe for women, high-minded women to go into. But if you look at really the first 100 years of tea consumption in Europe, and we'll focus mostly on England because England is pretty much the last tea country in Europe. The rest are drink coffee more than tea. That you saw that women would drink tea, but they would drink them in their private rooms in their estates, and they would have their tea set up in closets and whatnot. But it was publicly, tea was a man's drink. And so what changed? Really, you saw a couple of trends. It was really in the late Georgian era, so this is like the late 1700s in England, and certainly with the Queen Victoria era, which started around 1837, that you saw this trend. So tea houses started to clean themselves up. So now women could start going to tea houses. And then most importantly, you saw the advertising kick in. There was certainly, you can see funny advertisements for tea by different tea companies, that most of which don't even exist anymore. But they had advertisements in the 1700s, but really it was in the 1800s that you started to see a lot more tea advertisements. And the tea advertisements were toward women. The tea advertisements had pictures of women drinking it. Also around this time, Lady Bedford apocryphally is ascribed to creating the afternoon tea we talk about in that series. And this is about 1830s, 1840s, where you start getting the protocol and routine of the afternoon tea. Many times misquoted as high tea. It's not high tea. High tea is a working class meal with fish or stew, where tea is just happen to be drunk. It's truly afternoon tea that we think of today with the tiered desserts and the scones and the sandwiches and all that. So you see this around the 1840s really being kind of formalized. And then you see this being ushered out into the fancy hotels like the Ritz-Carlton in the later 1800s. And then you see the advertising all gearing up toward women. So if you think about this is kind of the milieu that men are seeing. And the same type of advertisement you would see in high-minded Edith Wharton-esque America at the same time. And so this carried on all through the 20th century, where tea commercials, tea advertisements were women, 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 because at this point, women, especially when you get into the 20th century, like after World War II, women had the power given to them by their husbands to make the purchases at the grocery store. Men are at work, whatever, women are going to the grocery stores. And so they're not stupid, right? You think of all the advertisements that were geared toward women, not just beauty and cosmetics, but think of all the food and all these things. And so these tea companies were smart. They knew that women at this point were making all the purchases. And so the advertisements were geared toward them. And so this didn't really change. So when you think of the typical man, let's say my age, 50 or older, they grew up at a time where coffee advertisements and coffee commercials were both men and women, but the coffee ads in magazines were men. Men were in the pictures. And you saw that and you didn't see that with tea. And so a lot of this is just kind of like the environment that we grew up in. So we grew up in a time in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s where tea was a woman's drink. And no one ever George Orwell has that great saying from 1984, his seminal novel, those who control the present control the past, and those who control the past control the future. And it's kind of the same thing. Like if all you know is the present and you know nothing about the past, you wouldn't know that tea was a man's drink. It's the same thing. All these men growing up in the aforementioned periods wouldn't know that tea was consumed globally. They think and consumed by men. They would just think, oh, it's something my mom, my grandma drank. They put some black tea with milk and sugar and ate some scone or something with it, or biscuit or something, or a cookie with it. And that's all they would know. And then if you see that all the teaware is dainty and demure and feminine, and it's not masculine at all, it's understandable to think that many men in your family, in your life, would think tea to be feminine. So all these things lined up to create a prejudice toward tea for most men. Now there are going to be men who did grow up with tea and they don't have this prejudice. And we've talked about it in the past, how really there's two segments of men, American men, because we're talking about American men, who drink hot tea. And so one is going to be military men. So these are going to be men that were stationed in places where tea consumption is high, which is pretty much being stationed anywhere in Asia, where they drink a lot of tea, going all the way from the Near East, like in Turkey. Turks drink the most tea per capita, all the way, of course, to Japan. If they were stationed in these places, they saw how tea culture is super vital, and they probably picked up this habit. So you'll see military men, not all military men, but military men will have more of an appreciation for tea. The other one is just going to be, of course, immigrants. You're going to see immigrants, let's say Japanese immigrants, Chinese American immigrants, Vietnamese American immigrants. They tend to have more of a predilection toward drinking tea. And the third one's just going to be higher socioeconomic men. So men that are well-traveled, men that are well-cultured, especially if they've traveled to Asia, they also are going to have more of appreciation for tea because they've seen the tea culture. Who's not going to really have an appreciation for tea? Well, it'll be the opposite. Provincial men who've never left their state, who have never been exposed to any of these things, to what the world offers in terms of different beverages. They're probably not going to be drinking kombucha or sake or anything like this either. Limoncello, whatever. They're not going to be drinking this because their worldview is much more limited and narrow. So this is one of the prejudices against tea. So in the next episode, we're going to start talking about like, how do you get men to start drinking tea, or how do you make them more amenable to drinking tea? Guys, post in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, take care and God bless.